The most notorious of all serial killers, without doubt, is the person who became known as Jack the Ripper. More books have been written and more movies made about him than about any other murderer. There are many reasons for this. The case was the first to show all the characteristics of what is now recognized as a classic pattern: the killing of a succession of women of a similar type, with no obvious motive except a sexual element, mutilation of the victims' bodies, the taking of organs as trophies, followed by teasing communications to the investigators, etc. Above all, the case has fascinated professional and amateur investigators alike for more than a century, because no person was ever charged with the crimes. From August to November 1888, the Whitechapel district of London's East End experienced a growing wave of panic as, one after another, at least 5 women were butchered in the night. Although all were prostitutes, this was of little reassurance to other women, as the savagery of the attacks threatened them all. The first certain victim was Mary Ann Nichols, whose corpse was discovered lying in the gateway to stables in the early hours of August 31st. It was only when the body was carried to the local mortuary that the extent of her injuries was revealed. Her throat had been cut twice, the killer's knife having slashed all the way through to the backbone. Yet even more horrifying was the fact that her abdomen had been ripped open and her intestines partly dragged out. The doctor who carried out the detailed autopsy declared that this murder in all had taken no more than 4 or 5 minutes, and that the butchery had been carried out deftly and skillfully by someone with rough anatomical knowledge. The savagery of the killing of Mary Ann Nichols made headlines, and not only in Britain. Even as far away as New York, the Times carried the story on September 4th. As one newspaper stated, no murder was ever more ferociously and more brutally done, but worse was to follow. On September 8th, around dawn, Annie Chapman's body was found in a small yard at the back of a house that was about a half-mile from where Mary Ann was killed. She had been mutilated with even greater ferocity. Her throat had been slashed so deeply that it seemed possible her killer had tried to decapitate her, and her intestines had been cut free and dumped on her right shoulder. The police surgeon who examined the corpse reported the knife used was a small amputating knife, or well-ground slaughterman's knife, narrow and sharp with a blade of 6 to 9 inches in length. The police were confident that both murders were by the same hand, and in the following weeks they investigated a number of possible suspects: local slaughtermen, medical students with a record of mental instability, even qualified physicians, but they had no success. Around September 18th, 19, the London police received a letter jeering at their efforts, but which they did not make public. Dated September 17th and apparently smeared with blood, it concluded, "I love my work and I shan't stop until I get buckled, and even then watch out for your old pal Jackie. Catch me if you can, Jack the Ripper. Sorry about the blood still messy from the last one." In the early hours of Sunday, September 30th, the Ripper struck twice, killing Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes. It seems probable that he was interrupted at his work on Elizabeth, for only her throat was cut and her body left unmutilated. And in a frustrated frenzy he attacked Catherine within half an hour and less than half a mile away. She had suffered gross mutilation. She was completely disemboweled, and her uterus and left kidney were missing. These two new killings fueled a public panic. Distressed by the failure of the police to find the culprit and prevent further killings, local residents had hastily formed a Whitechapel Vigilance Committee and hired two private detectives to investigate. It was the chairman of this committee, George Lusk, who received a small parcel at his home on October 16th. It contained a gruesome trophy, half a human kidney, which was declared to be almost certainly that of Catherine Edowis. With it was a note in handwriting similar to that of the September 17th letter. Addressed from hell and signed, "Catch me when you can," it read, "I send you half the kidney I took from one woman presarved it, for you t'other piece I fried and ate. It was very nice, I may send you the bloody niff that took it out, if you only want a while longer." The pathologist who had examined the kidney, Dr. Thomas Openshaw of the London Hospital, received a letter dated October 19th. This too was in similar handwriting and read in its entirety. "Old boss, you was right, it was the left kidney I was going to hoperate again close to your hospital just as I was going to draw me knife along of her bloomin' throat. Them cusses of coppers spoilt the game, but I guess I will be on the job soon and will send you another bit of innards. Jack the Ripper. Oh, have you seen the devil with his microscope and scalpel, a-looking at me kidney, with a slide cocked up. Whether this, so similar to the letters of September 17th and October 16th, was nevertheless a hoax is open to debate. There is little doubt that a number of other letters, written during the following weeks by persons with a malicious intention to keep the pot a-boiling, were false. The fifth killing in the series, and the last positively attributed to the Ripper, occurred in the early hours of November 9th, and was the most horrific of all. Mary Jane Kelly was only 25 years old and was murdered, not in the street like the other victims, but in her rented room. There, the Ripper had plenty of time to complete his obscene mutilations. The girl's head was almost severed from her body, and her facial features hacked beyond recognition. Both breasts and all the internal organs were cut away and arranged around the corpse, and much of the flesh was stripped off and piled on a nearby table in a vast puddle of blood. Finally, the autopsy revealed that the killer had cut out Mary Jane's heart and taken it with him. After this, no more was heard of the Ripper. Other later deaths were popularly attributed to him, but none of the victims suffered the characteristic mutilations. There are many possibilities, and innumerable theories have been advanced. Could he have been a lunatic who had temporarily absconded from the asylum and then returned of his own free will? Was he one of those who were committed to a mental institution for apparently unconnected reasons by the end of 1888? Perhaps he had died possibly of syphilis, which would explain his mental state and perverted sexual obsession, or committed suicide. There were even suggestions that he had left Britain, possibly for the United States. All that is certain is that he vanished from the streets of Whitechapel to survive as no more than a hideous legend. So, who was the Ripper? There were a number of witnesses who reported having seen a man in company with the later victims on the nights of the murders. Their descriptions had a certain consistency. He was shabby genteel, dark, short in build, and might have been a foreigner. Other details did not match, and the description, such as it was, could have fitted many men to be found in the nighttime streets of Whitechapel. The police had very little to go on, and many potential suspects. Over the years, well over 100 names have been proposed by amateur researchers, but very few suspects stand up to detailed consideration. One of the first suspects to attract police attention was the self-styled Dr. Rosalind Donston Stevenson. A practitioner of black magic, he wrote a number of articles about the Ripper case and was twice questioned by the police. His lover was the novelist Mabel Collins, and something that he showed her so horrified her that she became convinced he was the killer, but the authorities apparently were unable to establish any connection with the case. Among those who may be considered a possible Ripper suspect are the following. William Berry. He was in London during the crucial months and relocated with his wife to Dundee in January 1889. On February 5th, he murdered his wife, mutilating her body in a characteristic way. On the walls of the basement in which they lived, police found the chalked messages, "Jack Ripper is at the back of this door," and "Jack Ripper is in this cellar sick." Berry was hanged for his wife's murder on April 24th, 1889. Aaron Cohen. He was brought before the Whitechapel magistrates on December 7th, 1888, as a lunatic who had been found wandering at large. He was committed to an asylum where he violently attacked other inmates, refused food, and died on October 20th, 1889. Montague John Druitt. A schoolmaster and barrister, he was dismissed from his school after serious trouble on November 30th, 1888, and his drowned body was found in the River Thames on December 31st. Sir Melville Macnaghten, who became Assistant Chief Constable of the Metropolitan Police in June 1889, named him as the most likely suspect in a memorandum that came to public attention only in 1959. Aaron Kosminski. A century after the Ripper killings, in October 1988, two FBI psychological profilers, John Douglas and Roy Hazelwood, were invited onto a British TV show to give their opinions on the possible identification of the suspect. They both agreed on Kosminski. He was a Polish Jew, a bootmaker who arrived in London in 1882 and was diagnosed as suffering from syphilis 6 months before the first of the murders. Macnaghten had named him as another suspect, and in 1987 some marginal notes were found in a book that had been written by Sir Robert Anderson, who was for a time in charge of the Ripper investigation. Anderson wrote, "The only person who ever had a good view of the murderer unhesitatingly identified the suspect the instant he was confronted by him, but he refused to give evidence against him." The pencil notes in the margin, written by Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, Anderson's predecessor, confirmed that this was Kosminski, who was committed to a lunatic asylum and died there in 1919. More recently, the British criminologist Professor David Cantor argued that to maintain the optimum distance that balances familiarity and risk, you would have to commit your crimes in a circular region around your home. He drew up a map pinpointing the sites of the Ripper murders. At its center lay the home of Kosminski's brother, Wolf. Michael Ostrog Macnaghten described him as a mad Russian doctor and convict and unquestionably a homicidal maniac. The man was said to have been habitually cruel to women and for a long time was known to have carried about with him surgical knives and other instruments. His antecedents were of the very worst, and his whereabouts at the time of the Whitechapel murders could never be satisfactorily accounted for. It is recorded that Ostrog was sentenced to 2 years' imprisonment in Paris, France, on November 18, 1888. Dr. John Williams, an unlikely suspect, but backed by some persuasive circumstantial evidence. In his book Uncle Jack, published in 2006, Tony Williams puts forward the name of his great-uncle as that of the Ripper. Dr. Williams was a distinguished Victorian gynecologist, a consultant to the royal family, and one of the founders of the National Library of Wales. However, his great-nephew received a mysterious box that had been passed down, which yielded a knife, some microscope slides, and a letter from 1888, in which Dr. Williams stated that he had to be in Whitechapel that evening. Further research in the National Library archives uncovered a diary entry that appeared to confirm that Dr. Williams had performed an abortion on Mary Ann Nichols, one of the Ripper's victims 3 years earlier. These are the principal suspects. Only one thing is certain: the true identity of Jack the Ripper will never be satisfactorily established.